Welcome, everyone, to another installation of our Alignable Technology Industry Group Lunch and Learn. I have the pleasure of hosting Mr. Chris Foulon today. Chris is an experienced cybersecurity executive, coach, business leader, and someone that I have a lot of admiration for, especially about the work that he's doing on helping prepare the next generation of cybersecurity professionals. So my name is William McBurrow. I am the group leader of the Alignable Technology Industry Group. Within this group, we try to create an environment where technology business owners can network, create relationships, share referrals and leads, build strategic partnerships, but also share knowledge. And with that in mind, we have a series of lunch and learns in which industry experts such as Chris are given an opportunity to share with the rest of us all of their knowledge and experience within their various areas of expertise. So today we're going to be having a conversation about the shared responsibility model for cloud services. All of us today are using cloud services. Most of us are users. Some of us are cloud service providers. And oftentimes there's a misunderstanding of what's the provider's responsibility and what's the organization's responsibility. As a cybersecurity consultant, I encounter this very often because there's always an assumption that the provider is responsible for more than they actually are. So we greatly appreciate Chris sharing his experience with us to help us all better understand what that shared responsibility model looks like. So with that, thanks again for your time, Chris. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. As Will mentioned, I'm a cybersecurity professional. I run an organization called CPF Coaching, where we focus on providing executive level fractional CISO services and advisory. Oftentimes, with my clients, I see a lot of confusion around this topic of shared responsibility. So that's why I wanted to have this lunch and learn today. That being said, let's move on. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will address them as they come up, or at the end, we'll have some interaction along the way. So our first point today is really understanding what the shared responsibility model is and how that affects you as well as the cloud service provider. So looking over here at the cloud ecosystem, we have the SaaS customers on the right, the SaaS vendors on the left, and the cloud hosting it in between. Typically, your SaaS customers are responsible for user access, data, and some level of application security, whereas your SaaS providers are providing you the system, application, and hosting of that. But we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper so that we understand where those differences lie. So today we'll go over the shared responsibility model, customers' responsibilities, cloud service providers' responsibilities, a kind of breakdown of the service model, and some of the challenges and best practices that we can use. So a general overview of how to look at the shared responsibility model is using this stack diagram. On the left, we have the traditional on-premise model where the customer is responsible for everything from user access all the way down to physical access and provisioning of that environment. As we move over to cloud services, which does include infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, we see there's a shifting layer of responsibility depending on which aspect is used. We'll go through those, but what I really want to highlight is that as a customer, you're typically always responsible for user access and identity management, as well as data, whether the cloud service provider is hosting the data or not. It is always your responsibility. So don't rest on your laurels thinking that the cloud service provider is going to be the one responsible for data. You're simply providing that service to you, and in one way or another, you're always responsible for your data. So, as we discussed, first we're going to go through the customer responsibilities. Your data protection. This means ensuring that your data is protected at rest and in transit. So this could mean a couple different things. Depending on what you're doing, you may or may not be able to protect the data when it's in the service. But if there are opportunities to do, and your data is that sensitive, you should take those opportunities to encrypt wherever possible your data, as it is ultimately always your responsibility. You're the one that's going to be on the headlines. You're the one that your customers are going to say, hey, you were responsible for that breach. So keep that in mind. Access management. So you're responsible for your own user identities, as well as what those user identities can and can't do within your environment. As you go down in the layers, you might be responsible for application security, implementing the necessary security measures for the application, for the access management, for the data protection, configuration management, and management of those cloud services. So if you're going down to, say, platform as a service, you're responsible for those cloud platforms. And then infrastructure as a service, you're responsible for the operating system as well as the endpoint security within the environment. So again, depending on what adventure you choose within the cloud service model, you do always have something to be responsible for. As we shift over to the cloud service provider, we're going to work our way from bottoms up. So if they're responsible for the infrastructure, they tend to provide ensuring that the endpoints for platform as a service, they would tend to ensure that their endpoints are secured, that the operating systems are updated as they go on to providing you additional services. They ensure that those cloud resources are being properly configured, management of them. If there's need for scale, which is one of the reasons many people go to cloud service providers, they will automatically manage the health and scaling of those applications. For application security, when you're providing that final layer of SaaS. Now, they could help with access management or providing you with the tools for access management or data protection and providing you the tools for those data protections. But they're typically not the ones responsible for this in the end. They simply would provide you with the mechanisms to do. As there has been more and more cloud breaches, they've been working on proactively ensuring that those protections are enabled by default, closing off, say, S3 buckets from being open to the world, or ensuring that S3 buckets are encrypted by default. Those are just some examples of some of the proactive steps that cloud service providers have been taking to minimize the net impact on clients when they're enabling cloud services. So the shared responsibility comes in where both parties are responsible to ensure that there's a proper configuration in place, where there's need for regulatory compliance and monitoring. Both parties are responsible for that. And then for the collaboration of incidents and incident detection and remediation. This is particularly important because as you migrate to cloud services, you have less and less visibility into the inner workings of the cloud service provider. So therefore, they need to be helping you in assistance to remediate some of these situations. Not all of them, but some of them. So as we discussed earlier, this lays out where customers have these shared responsibilities. Cloud service providers have these shared responsibilities and overlapping shared responsibilities. As we can see, for infrastructure as a service, your customer is responsible down to the OS for management, application security, data encryption, network encryption, whereas the cloud service provider is typically just responsible for physical infrastructure, virtualization, and network security. If we flip to the other end of this, in a SaaS world, the customer is responsible for data security and user access management. The cloud service provider is responsible for the application security as well, and infrastructure security for everything below it. Now, what are some of the challenges here? Access control is definitely one of the major challenges that we see on the market today, where clients might not be 100% sure who's doing the access control, where are all the configurations, what needs to be done, and even the impacts of those access control changes. That's why it could get particularly hairy once you jump down to infrastructure as a service, and you really need to understand security for all the different layers. And if you're in multiple cloud providers, you now have to understand the differences from one cloud provider to another cloud provider. And oftentimes they use slightly different terminology. Their services have different names, and there's no one-to-one matching of controls between different cloud service providers. In this case, clients can look to use a third party that can help manage their access control and identity to help normalize how they can control that and use that third party as their dashboard to do. Vagueness and ambiguities. Sometimes, depending on where in the model, there might be confusions because one cloud service provider might provide a certain level of access, say at platform as a service, but another cloud provider might do it differently. So it's really upon the client to understand what they're responsible for and to clear up any vagueness and ambiguity within what they're responsible for when moving to a new cloud provider. Incident management, as we discussed, because there's additional layers of vagueness and less visibility as we move to different layers of cloud providers, you really need to understand where the responsibility matrix is for incident detection and response, and then how do you coordinate services between yourself and your cloud service provider. Now, last one is definitely complexity sprawl as we manage multiple cloud service providers. We potentially have some infrastructure as a service, some software as a service, and as software as a service grows out to include things like AI and other advanced services, there becomes some complexity in really understanding where that shared responsibility is, who's responsible for what, and how do you manage the privacy and data protection of your data. Remember, it's always your data, and you're the one responsible for it. Now, as we look at some best practices that you can utilize here, first, start out with understanding who's responsible for what, creating RACI matrix of what's clearly defined and understandable for each party. Most of the times, your cloud service providers tend to provide you with this, and then you need to ask additional questions to drill down into where you might have confusion so that you can clear this up before you start moving your applications into production with those cloud service providers. Next, highly recommend working on implementing strong access controls, whether you're using role-based access controls, RBACs, you're using additional multi-factor authentication or identity management services. These additional layers of identity protection helps provide that extra layer of protection for your data and your users in the cloud. Next, if you're responsible for any patching or updating within your infrastructure, this is typically infrastructure as a service. You want to make sure that you keep up with this because this is your responsibility. And sometimes in the cloud, you might think that someone else is being responsible for it. But when it comes to infrastructure as a service, this is your responsibility. A lot of the cloud service providers are now offering tools that help automate some of this patching and management, but they typically come with an additional service charge. So do work with your cloud service providers to ensure that you understand that and you can use that. Next, you want to ensure that you're continuously monitoring and auditing your environment for anomalies, for billing use cases, because if your environment isn't properly configured, you could have a malicious actor either taking your data or consuming your services, in which case you'll end up with the bill for the malicious use by the threat actor, or them using your environment to mirror attacks against another cloud service provider or cloud service providee client. So make sure that you're monitoring and auditing your environment for that. Lastly, you want to ensure that you're continuously training and educating your stakeholders for their responsibilities. As you're the one providing the service to a client or to your organization, you want to ensure that your end stakeholders understand that they have a shared responsibility as well. Things like reporting if you're seeing anomalous activity in their account, if their username and password was reused and potentially noticed in another breach, things like this you should be aware of so that they can have that awareness to bring to you and ensure that you can provide that safety in the end. So now we'll break down where those different aspects lay and show you a better visual as to why there could be some vagueness and confusion as to who does what. So remember, on the left, we have your traditional IT model where you're responsible for the entire stack. Next, we have your infrastructure as a service model where you tend to be responsible all the way down to the operating system. Now, the reason that the operating system here is shaded is because sometimes your cloud service provider could be the one providing you with that operating system. And it could be potentially from, say, their marketplace where they have third parties that are creating and marketing the operating system for consumption. So that could be why that there's some shading here and some mixture of responsibility between you and what's delivered as a service to you. In platform as a service, they deliver through the middleware all the way up to the runtime, and you're still responsible for your data and your applications. In software as a service, the cloud service provider tends to deliver all the way through the application layer. But remember, you still are responsible for access to the applications and management of the data, even though they're delivering this to you as a service. So just to reiterate, in a SaaS model, clients have the least amount of responsibility. They're responsible for managing user access, ensuring and protecting their data. This includes setting up permissions, protecting login credentials from phishing or social engineering attacks. The cloud service provider assumes the majority of the responsibility, including the security of the application, underlying infrastructure, and the data produced by the application. They manage the application level security and ensure that systems are running up to performance. For platform as a service, the platform is provided to the customers, but they're responsible for the security of the application and their data. They manage user access, ensure that any of the code or data produced by the platform is secure. The cloud service provider itself manages the responsibility of the platform, the operating system, the runtime, and the middleware. They ensure that the platform is secure, and they're providing the infrastructures to support that platform. Lastly, infrastructure as a service. In this model, the customer has the most responsibility. They're responsible for managing the security of the operating system, applications, data, and configurations of the infrastructure provided by the cloud service provider. This means managing, accessing, installing security patches, configuring network controls such as firewalls, and everything in between. The cloud service provider typically is only responsible for providing underlying infrastructure, physical access to the data center, networking, and the virtualization layer. They ensure that the hardware and basic cloud infrastructure is there and secure for you to use. So, homework for you, if you're watching this, ensure that you reach out and you fully understand all the shared responsibilities between you and your cloud service providers. You develop an inventory of all your cloud service providers, and you understand the shared responsibility matrix for each of them. Educate your client, business, and stakeholders on where the difference of the responsibility lays. And if you need help with that, companies like CPF Coaching and Williams companies are happy to help you with that. Now, if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. William, how are things going?
Chris, thanks so much. Let's see if any questions coming via the Q&A, or folks can also raise their hand if they would like to ask a question live. Thanks so much for sharing that information. There were a lot of gems there. I have a series of questions that I made note of. So if you don't mind, you can indulge me.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that you did not touch on was the question of liability. One of the things that I often tell my clients who are leveraging cloud services is the fact that you might be able to outsource your IT, but you can't outsource the governance, or you can't outsource the liability. Any thoughts on how users of cloud services should think about, associated potential liability?
Yes, and that's why I reinforce the topic that customers are always responsible for access to the cloud services that you're using, as well as the data that you're using. It's because exposure of that data is typically what they become liable for. So breaches of privacy, breaches of confidential information, that is something that they are ultimately always responsible and liable for. Now, they can use third parties to help protect against this and to help with the remediation and response, but they're still responsible and liable in the end for this. And they can use such things as transference mechanisms through using cyber insurance to help protect against the financial aspect of liability, but they're in the eyes of the customer, they're always going to be the liable one for any misuses or exposures of their information.
Great points, great points. So that leads to my next question around data governance. How should users of cloud services think about how to put in place a model for data governance?
Data governance ultimately comes down to truly understanding what data you have, where it is stored, and how it's being used, whether that's on premise or in the cloud. So, starting with that foundational approach, they can start there. Then they can start to use to leverage the scale of cloud to help them identify, classify, and tag data and put protection mechanisms around that, depending on where in the stack they are or what type of cloud services they're using. But ultimately, they're still the ones that need to start up with that data tagging, classification, and protection mechanisms.
Great. One of the things that I often come across is an assumption of data protection, right? When companies are leveraging cloud services, there's an assumption that there's security being provided and all of the data is being protected by the CSP. What would you say to that assumption that the provider is protecting my data?
While they might use data protection mechanisms for encrypting the data in the physical servers that you're using, typically at the application level or the user level, they're visible to those users and you're unprotected. So you still have to use your own protection mechanisms to protect the data within the virtualized environment or the cloud service provided environment and control the access to them.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Another question that came in was a reference to security services that are cloud-based, right? So now we're not just talking about the generic cloud services. How does the model that you've described relate to security services providers that are providing security services via the cloud? One assumption that jumps to mind, obviously, is the recent CrowdStrike and the debacle. So what are some of your thoughts about, are there any changes in how you think about this if the CSP is providing cybersecurity services?
No, you still have to ultimately understand who's doing what and what you're responsible for, even if your cloud provider is the one providing you with tools and mechanisms to gain visibility, you're still the one responsible to ensure that security and to use the protection services that they might be providing to protect your data and applications.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let me know when you've had enough, right? I can go on forever with these.
Well, I have another meeting scheduled right now, so I'll take the last one.
All right, I'll take the last one. Let's see. Okay, one phrase that jumped to my mind was when you talked about how some CSPs are endeavoring to provide what I think I termed here data protection by default, right? They are pre-configuring their environments with certain types of mechanisms configured to protect the user. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I'll just use Amazon as an example.
Yeah.
In the wake of exposures that they've had from clients not fully understanding that
Yeah.
they need to secure their cloud buckets from external access, they're starting to enable, say, internal use only or encrypted access of uploads, mechanisms like this to really limit the negative exposure that the cloud service provider has been getting because their clients have not been aware of that shared responsibility. Typically, when you buy a service, you expect it to be running 100%,
Mm.
so they would give it unconfigured to you. Now they're rolling that back a little bit and going, okay, here's some basic protections that we're going to put in place, and if you want to change that and then open it back up to the world, go ahead. But we've noticed that some clients tend to prefer it being secured a little more by default,
Mhm.
and then you can unwind those security mechanisms based on your use case.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for that. I do know and appreciate that you have to run. I'm going to keep my other 10 questions for our cybersecurity mastermind session that is coming up here shortly. Thanks again for joining us, Chris. Any parting words of wisdom for us?
I would say work with security providers like yourself, like myself, to really understand what responsibilities you have so that you can ensure that you're properly protecting your data.
I couldn't say that better myself. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Al.